today, me and Filipa, we'll be
Yeah.
having a conversation about various topics. We did have a think about whether we would structure the conversation, but we just decided actually that we'll just put it together and go with it, because actually we have I feel like just even from our content, we've got very similar, we've definitely got similar interests, that's for sure. Filipa, you created Awkward Parents. Maybe you could just start with explaining very briefly about what it is that you do, why you do it, and what your mission is.
All right. Thank you so much, first of all, for having me, for this opportunity to exchange ideas on these hot topics around sexuality, children's sexuality, and how to deal with these expressions, right? So my goal is to help awkward parents give their children mindful sexual education. So help parents figure out what their own hang-ups are in terms of their sexuality, and what they feel comfortable and not talking to their kids about, and how we can process those feelings, and how we can be proactive and productive in the way that we process them. And the other part of my work is also helping parents with child abuse, sexual abuse prevention.
Yeah, okay. So they're all very, very important topics, and ones that I cover on my page slightly, not all the time, but slightly. I suppose my first question is, because I've been following you for a little while now, and I'm definitely interested in what you're posting. I feel like we both know that there's resistance to parents even wanting to get involved in this, or feeling shy to get involved in this, or they feel like, maybe just the school will do this, and we don't need to talk about it all the time, which I think we both agree that actually this is something that needs to be talked all the time. Why do you think there's like, where do you think this resistance comes from, and why is it here?
I think that adults today were taught about sexual education on the basis of fear, guilt, shame. So the experiences that parents had in terms of their own journey of sexual education really informs how they then pass on these values onto their children, right? I also feel that when we talk about sexual education, parents have this fear that we are teaching kids how to have sex.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So anything that has to do with sexuality, us as adults, because of our own experience of sexuality, we are almost unable to switch off from that idea of, oh, if we're talking about body parts, then we are talking about having sex and, masturbation, and all these very dense topics that so many people have problems talking about, also because of their own experience, right? We find that a lot of adults have a lot of traumas and hang-ups around their own sexuality that actually dates back from when they were children, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like you have some parents who are like, the school will take care of this, and I don't have to do this. And on the other hand, we have the parents who are like, I don't want my kids to learn about this outside the home, and it is our job to do this, but we're still not going to do it.
Yeah, okay. So you made two really interesting points, and actually I'm sure I spoke on a video about one of those points quite recently, and I actually questioned myself, and I was like, why do we have this like huge resistance? Oh, sorry, my phone is just fallen over. Why do we have this huge resistance to talking about something that we all know about, we all want, we all enjoy, and actually we all hope that everyone else enjoys? And why do we have this massive resistance about just talking about it? And has that come from the fact that we learned that behavior from the adults who didn't talk to us about sex and sex education. So yeah, such an interesting point. I feel like actually probably a lot of that has come from there. You know, that we sensed as young people, even like, let's take ages under 10, we sensed the adults around us not wanting to talk about it. The education was, I mean, I just even remember the video that we watched. We were in year 6, so here in England year 6 is 11 years old, and the video we watched was just like, I mean, it felt old school to me. And you know, none of the teachers would have said anything about it. So probably I learned a lot about how I possibly will behave as an adult when I get to an adult from that child experience. So yeah, I just find that a really interesting point. And I mean, what can we do about that except for break the traditions, you know, break that culture? And I suppose it starts with us, because we realize that that's not very productive at all. And then the other point that you made, which I really like, is which I haven't really thought about it in the words that you use, is when we talk to children about private areas, or even if we want to label the body parts the names that they are, we're not teaching them how to have sex. It's such a great point that you make. We're not teaching them, or even we're not. It's almost like, now you've made that point, I feel like some people may feel like they're encouraging their children to have sex if they start talking to them about sex, or even just private body parts. And that's just obviously not the aim at all. We're not trying to teach them or influence them to have sex earlier. We just want them to be aware of this thing that there is, that we all will do at some point. And why wouldn't we talk about that? So it brings me on to it brings me on to the video that I recently released, which is what initiated this conversation, right? You wrote to me, or you commented on that post saying that you'd love to talk about it. And so that's why I thought, you know, let's just have this conversation. And the live environment, I think, is a great way to do it, because then anybody that's watching, by the way, anybody that is watching, feel free to put your comment in the chat box, and we will read them out as they come through. So I released that video, which was, would you bathe naked with your children? And before I watched it, I felt, you know, I feel automatic resistance to these things, because I'm a human being in this culture and I'm part of this culture. So I do feel like, you know, would I get in the bath with my young child naked? I don't think I would. But then I watched the video, and I'm not saying now that I've watched the video that I would, but what I'm saying is I thought they had some excellent points. So I'd be really interested to know what you think about what they were saying on that video.
Well, first, I think it's important to listen to these feelings that we have towards these topics, because they do tell us that there's something about whatever it is that we're discussing that we have to look into, right? And it doesn't mean that every time you feel resistance to something that you should tackle this resistance, you know?
Yeah.
And so before we get onto this, to answer one of your previous questions about why we feel awkward talking to children, what I have found also is that when kids ask parents where babies come from, for example, parents usually think about the fact that they had sex, that they had an intimate moment with a person, and that they did so-and-so position, and they're like, how am I going to explain this to a child? And this is not what the child is asking, right? So what we do is we make this question that is pretty vague in the child's mind, and we give it our personal context of how we perform during sex, for example.
Yeah, amazing.
You know? And obviously you don't want to be discussing that, because that's part of your intimacy, right? Yeah. So there has to be some kind of distancing in between your personal experience of sex and talking about sex from an informational point of view when you're explaining it to kids.
Yeah,
right?
Okay. So before you move on then, please, because that's an interesting point. So what we're trying to say is, when curious 6-year-old says, where are babies from? We are putting our adult perception on that question, because adults, we're like, sex is where that came from. But of course, a child is actually, you can answer that question with sex being not even in the answer, right? Because the baby is, correct me if I'm wrong, the baby is grown in the mother's tummy. So you can start explain all of that, right?
Well, yeah, my advice to when kids ask any questions is that you the first thing you do is that you ask the question back at them. What do you think about this? Where do you think babies come from? So that you, one, have time to think about what you're going to say.
Yeah.
You know, we're human, and this is the human interaction.
Yeah.
And it's okay that you feel awkward and that you're taken back by this. And a lot of the times kids ask these questions in a public space, in a moment where parents are not really, you know, expecting, right? So you stop, you ask, what do you think? Gives you time to pause, recompose.
Yeah, nice.
And also it gives you a baseline of their understanding of what's happening.
Okay.
Right? So there you get an idea of what your kid knows, what kind of information you need to add, and what kind of misinformation you need to correct.
Fantastic.
The other thing is, kids want to know the emotional response as well. So where do babies come from? They want to know where they come from. Where did I come from?
Okay.
And so here I would say you give the explanation depending on the age of, you know, it. For example, parents try to get away from the sex question by saying, you grew inside mommy's tummy, right? And so, for some kids, that will be enough. For others, they will turn around and be like, how did I get there?
Yes.
You know? And there you talk about how there's the cell in that the man has that then joins. And if there's more questions, you will have to talk about, you know, a penis going inside a vagina.
Yeah, okay.
But then you also decide how these things are said, right? The other thing you want to say is, when I found out I was pregnant, I was so happy. This is how I felt when I felt you inside me. You know, when you were born, I was scared, but I was so happy when I saw your face for the first time. You know, you want to know about, you know, your experience with them.
Yeah, amazing. That's so loving, by the way, what you just said there. I think a child would love to hear that.
Yeah.
Love to hear that. So what the point you're making, which is, I just think, valuable advice for, actually, I just think any conversation, even sometimes adult to adult conversation, maybe that's valuable advice, where if they ask you a question, let's just stick with the topic though, it's when a child asks you a difficult question, if you ask the question back to them, it's going to give you more time to think, which is going to be really helpful. And also then you can gauge the level that they're thinking at. Yeah. Because right, you may go, if you don't do that procedure, you're going to go back at them and you may overload them, or you may leave them still hanging for more. Right? So you can find that, you can judge the level where they're at, and if they're your child, you will also really feel the level that they're at and what they're asking, what they're looking for. Yeah, what they're actually looking for from you. So that's really great.
In the end, what you want to do is ask something like, how do you feel about that answer, or what did you understand by it, so that you also gauge whether the child understood what you were saying.
Yeah. Okay. It's I really like
constant feedback loop, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's very curious. I don't know if you have felt this, that we have an understanding of children in our society is that they're these small beings who are just vessels, right? And not really, that they don't have their own personality and their own humanity that comes inherently with them. And if you think about this, like, these are the most basic questions that we as adults ask ourselves as well. Where do we come from? What are we doing here? And what happens when we die?
Okay. Yeah. So they're actually questions that we're continuing to answer throughout our lives. They're not like child questions.
Yeah.
Amazing. I always have a feeling that sometimes we think of children as I think uneducated is the wrong word, right? But I'm just trying to think of the right word. But because they can't do adult things like drive and get a job, we think that they're like, you know,
in the process of becoming something.
Yeah, but they know, they're curious. They actually are so valuable. They know things. They can feel emotion. They're telling you. Sometimes they're not telling you with words, but they're so clever in telling you what they want or what they desire or what they're not happy with. So I don't think we give children enough credit. I really don't. And then
What you're talking about there is such a crucial part of sexual education, and I wish there was another name for this. Because I feel like when we talk about sexual education, it comes with so many of the prejudices that, you know, are difficult for us to dispel because of everything that we have attached to it. But what you're talking about right now, how children feel and how they love and how they express themselves is child sexuality. You know,
okay, explain that a little bit.
To do with sexual desire of, you know, of achieving orgasm or of looking for a mate. Like us adults, I mean, we only get to this when we're in puberty, adolescence, because our levels of hormones increase, sex hormones in our bodies increase, and they guide us, and this is when we start getting sex drive, right? But before that, our sexuality is really about our interaction with our bodies and with socializing with other people, kind of understanding what our context is. Right. So I always say that sexual education is really learning how to love and be loved. That's really the basic of it, whether you are a child or an adult, you know.
Yeah. Okay, now you're always going to come up against some backlash to put children who are, I don't know, prepubescent in talking about expressing themselves in a sexual nature.
I have something to say about that.
Please.
So we call that premature eroticization of children.
Okay.
So, children who are exposed to inappropriate content will exhibit behavior that is not typical of their age.
Okay.
And this inappropriate content can be porn on a more, so it can be porn, it can be a sign of them being sexually abused as well. Or it can be just the fact that they are trying to work out a behavior that they have seen. So for example, if they walk in on their parents, right? And they have a particularly negative reaction towards this, you know, the whole screaming and get out and whatever. So what happens is kids then mimic this behavior that they see in order to try to understand what they have seen.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That it's a bit like when kids want to watch the same cartoons over and over again.
Yes. Okay.
So they do this over and over again because they're absorbing the lessons from the cartoon that they're watching.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so children do both repetition and role playing, and this is how they learn and interpret the world around them, right? So what happens when kids are exposed to inappropriate content is they don't know what to do with that information. So they will display this by themselves, or they will enact it with other children.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So now we start to find some reasoning and some of the explanation of why when children are sexually abused from a very young age, they then reenact this on even siblings or children, right?
Sorry.
And what you're saying is one of the reasons for that is because they're trying to make sense of what was the behavior that was done onto them, and one of the ways that young people try to make sense of things in their head is by performing that action again. But what are they looking for when they perform that action again? What is it? How are they learning from that?
So here I feel like we have to be a bit mindful of the words that we use in terms of age, because I felt like the video that you had commented on as well talked about children. Are we talking about children as teenagers, or are we talking about young children, right? Because young children for until the age of like 9, 10, they do a lot of this repetition and a lot of this learning that has to do with, like, they want to figure out, for example, why certain things feel good and why certain things feel bad. But it's not just figuring out their bodies, it's figuring out their emotions, right?
Yeah.
I don't think the same can be said to about teenagers, because teenagers have they have higher content of sex hormones in their bodies. So how they process things around them is different. Their level of cognition is different. So they know what they're doing, teenage. So there are several ways that children who have been sexually abused then show that to the world and ask for help, right? Wow. Because whatever way this is being expressed, it is a call for help.
Wow.
So one thing that I think is very important, and I hate seeing this on a lot of the sex ed and sexual abuse prevention stuff, is, oh, children abuse children. No, children don't abuse children. There's two victims if you have a atypical sexual game between children.
Yes.
You know what I mean? If you have a 6-year-old who is forcibly trying to touch or see somebody else's body or genitals or whatever, this kid is not some kind of
predator.
This is a kid who is also a victim and should be treated as a victim and should be given adequate sexual education and given adequate psychological support, and not be treated like a bad person. This kid didn't just come up with this behavior on their own.
Yes. That's a really strong point to make. Do you feel like, and I kind of feel I know the answer, what your answer will be, but I'd like you to explain a little bit more, please. Do you feel like, let's take this situation where a child has been sexually abused themselves very young and they're reenacting this behavior on another child, maybe even a sibling. Do you feel like a excellent sexual education from throughout a child's life would be able to prevent this? We could make them aware and knowledgeable enough to recognize that to reenact this wouldn't be a good thing. That's not what I need to do. I need to, is there any way we can step in?
Yeah, definitely. So a kid or an adult, a person who has been a victim of sexual abuse, I strongly advise that they are taken to a good psychologist. If the more specialized the psychologist, the better, right? And I think a very interesting finding is that what traumatizes, this is going to sound awful, but one of the things that traumatizes people the most, children and then adults, when it comes to sexual abuse, is not the sexual abuse itself when it's not violent, but how the people around the victim behave towards them, towards the abuser, and how the story is reinterpreted throughout the different stages of life. Because if you have a small child who was abused, and they get the support. And it's not just the child getting the support, it's the parents getting the support as a family for them to learn how to deal with whatever somatic reactions the kids are going to have. So, you know, if you have a kid who goes to a psychologist and they talk about what happened, or, you know, however the process of that specific child takes place, then you have a family that is a loving and supportive family that is constantly reminding this kid that what happened was not their fault, and that they are loved regardless of, and that they are fine, that they are healthy, and that everything's going to be okay. The chances of that kid then being a traumatized teenager who's then a traumatized adult are reduced.
Yeah.
Right? Now, if you have a situation, which I have sadly seen on a lot of the cases that you have on your something to say page, is, have you noticed how they were not believed, these victims, how the people that they trusted the most with this information didn't care, how they blamed them for what had happened?
Yeah.
You know, because if you don't start this process of healing when the abuse takes place, when kids are very young, then what happens is they become teenagers with all these hormones as well, and their way of dealing with sexual abuse may be that they shy away from physical, emotional contact with other people, they're very withdrawn. Or it can be the total opposite, that you have teenagers who are extremely promiscuous because they have found in sex a way of expressing their feelings. So this is the only way they know how to tell other people that they like them, or this is the only way that they feel they can regain some kind of control over their own bodies, over how they feel when they have sex. And also a way of saying, you don't have a power over me just because we're having sex, because I have sex with everybody. You know, I'm not making a moral judgment on that, but I am saying that if it's coming from a place of abuse and trauma and pain, then this is not a healthy way to process feelings.
Okay, so this is all information that I feel needs to be communicated to everyone, right? I mean, and my continuous struggle is to try to get this type of thing communicated, but in ways that people are going to watch it, and in ways that people are going to engage with. Because everything you've just said in the last 3 or 4 minutes would be interesting to anyone to hear. I really believe it. It's just, as soon as you label it sex education, it's like, that's boring, or the child, or we don't want our child listening to that, or we don't want to even listen to that. It's almost like we need another term for this, or we just have to make videos and stuff that I don't know, that come at it from a different angle. I don't know.
Well, I think you're doing a incredible job about that with your videos and the content that you're putting out. I think that you are revolutionizing the way we are looking at these very sensitive topics that people shy away from. So, because I think there has to be some kind of balance between being somebody who's constantly alerting the public and a fear monger.
Yes.
You know, like, there's a fine balance there. And I actually wanted to ask you, because I saw your latest post on Instagram, is how do you feel with your own personal experience? How do you feel literally wearing your heart on your, with your new merchandise? How are you feeling about that?
It's so incredible when massive moves like that are made. It's so incredible to now and again think about, you know, this time last year, or when it all started, or you know, something like the merchandise is huge, because it was a vision when I first started this. When I first started, like, I set up the YouTube channel and things, I was watching people and how they were doing things, and I saw lots of people were doing merchandise, etc. And then, you know, to try to create something that people can wear and feel proud of wearing, that doesn't say abuse prevention on it, you know. Yeah, that doesn't say child abuse, child sexual abuse, I am a survivor. That doesn't say that. It has something else on it that you can wear and like just feel proud to wear. And some people won't even know what it is. Yeah, they'll just see it as a clothing label, right? So I do feel really proud about that, and I don't often feel, I don't know, feeling proud about your own work. I don't know. It's just, for me, I find that a little bit difficult. But since the merchandise has been out, that has been a real moment. And yeah, I just posted like an hour ago about wearing it out for the first time. It was just so incredible. But I am very lucky. I just want to add, I'm very lucky because over the years, I now have this team of people, right? That and you know what? As far as I know, the 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5 people I'm working with, none of them are abuse survivors, sexual abuse survivors, child sexual abuse survivors. Actually, what they are is they're just artists in their own right, or editors, or whoever that is. And they just have such a passion for the importance of this topic. And I feel like that's because they've seen my work somewhere. And like we just said, I feel like if I'm just always going to talk about child sexual abuse and its horrific nature and the tragedy of it and the statistics about how it's always going on all the time, that's going to be good, right? No doubt about it, because that needs to be talked about. But I feel like that's so uncomfortable for people just to see all the time. I'm going to lose the engagement of certain people. I want to have a mix on there. Sometimes I want to talk about the highs and sometimes I want to talk about the lows. Sometimes I want to talk about my personal story. Sometimes I want to talk about education. So yeah, I do try to mix and match it. So yeah, to answer your question, I feel really good about what's going on. Yeah.
I'm really happy for you. And, you know, if you think about it, this is your own expression of your own sexuality as well.
Yeah.
Because it's very much about our passion, not just our passion in our, you know, in our vulvas and our penises. For the things that give us life and our purpose and our mission. And I feel like a lot of this more macro scale of sexuality is very lost in the conversations we have. And I think it's incredible that what you're saying, I think, is very true to our personalities, right? We are not just one thing. We want to talk about several things and express them in different ways. And yeah.
Okay. So when you talked about, you know, that it's not necessarily actually the experience of being sexually abused that is the most traumatic thing that is in that situation. It's more so the way other people around you are talking about it, the way you see other survivors talking about it, and what you're reading on the articles that you read. That is actually in some way programming your reflection on what happened to you, because you're learning from other people's reactions, right? So I find that very interesting. One of the things I am trying to do, you know, especially hopefully for any men that really struggle with this, is to try to show people, is to try to encourage an alternative way of looking at the traumatic stuff or the rubbish stuff that happened to you back in the day. So that's one of my things that I try to do, because I'm trying to change my reaction to it. Yeah, I want to change my reaction to it, because I don't feel like if I just sit around in sadness and sorrow the whole time, then, you know, by the time I'm 60, I'm going to be very depressed. So yeah, I'm trying to do that. So one of my questions to you is, which actually relates to some charity work that I'm doing at the moment. I'm putting a proposal together to try to get into schools, and that's for a place called Taupe Line Support. We have fingers crossed. We are so soon going to be sending out the proposals. Now, my question is, we, of course, are all aiming for prevention, right? We want to get this in front of the kids. We want them to recognize symptoms. We want symptoms, the wrong word. We want them to recognize certain situations that could be dangerous. We want them to recognize before things go too far in relationships or any kind of situation they've got online. We want to teach them how to actually behave towards people as well. And we want to prevent all the types of abuse that are going on, people exploiting each other, people hurting each other's feelings, people wrecking each other's lives. We want to prevent all of those things. And if we can get in there early enough and have a continuous education, we stand the best chance of doing that. But what I'd be really interested to know is your advice or opinions or suggestions or conversation around how are we going to talk to, even start the conversation with, let's take a 15-year-old, for example, that has just spoken out about sexual abuse that they went through 5 years ago. How do we even start with that kind of conversation? Because it's still education. Education. Yeah.
Well, I would be a bit surprised if you encounter that kind of situation in a group setting.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So what I have seen happen in workshops that I have done is that very small children who don't fully understand what sexual abuse is will say in class in front of everybody that they're abused.
Okay.
So you'll have like a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old who will say, you say something like, oh, you know, and we must be watchful, and, you know, other people cannot touch our private parts and whatever. And a kid will say something like, oh, my uncle does that.
Oh.
So if they're very small, what you want to do there is you almost don't pay too much attention to it, because you don't want to shine the spotlight on this child, but you know, you're aware of what's happening, right? So at some point after the workshop, you take that child aside and you bring whoever in the school is supposed to be helping you with this, and then you are like, oh, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Right? And then you go into a prevention kind of protocol where or a incident protocol where you ask about you don't ask them what happened. You're like, oh, tell me a little bit more about this. Do you want to talk about it? And kids sometimes will say no, sometimes they will say yes. But then you have to pass this on to a psychologist, call the child's family, and call the police.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So a 15-year-old is a teenager who's aware of what sexual abuse is, whether
Yes.
sexually abused or not. They're less likely to have an outburst in public about this situation. What might happen is that they feel some kind of connection with you personally because of your story, and they come to you and open up to you. Here, I think that you have to really be prepared yourself, Jeremy, to hold space for something like this, and understand and figure out whether you're going to be triggered by the story and what kind of reaction you want to have towards it, right?
Yeah, I think I've got lots to prepare for as we kick off this thing, because I truly believe we're just going to be able to get into schools, and then the whole thing's going to start snowballing, and we're going to get into more and more. If we start talking about, like, when we talk about education on the whole, do we talk about education and what we let the children know what is allowed and what isn't allowed, but do we also need to be educating heavily about what to do if what you can do if this happens?
So this is a very curious thing. When I work with schools, I also work with teachers, because if the kids are telling the teachers have to know what's going on, right? Because it is, I don't think it's very responsible if we go into a school and we say, these are safe people for you to have conversations about these things with, and then we leave the school.
It's a good point.
And kids go to these teachers that we have indicated, and the teachers don't know how to deal with this. So I do teacher trainings as well.
Okay.
Right. And then depending on what country you're in, there are certain steps that have to be taken, but you have to alert the police. You have to make sure that this kid, whether they can go home or not, whether they're going to be safe at home or not, what is the best way of dealing with the situation if their abuser is in their home, right? Because a lot of the time the abusers are not going to be taken out of the home the same day that there's this exchange. The kid says, my parent or my sibling or whoever abused me. They're not going to be like, okay, so let's go remove this person from this household, right? These things take time, as you know. So these are nuances that we have to be aware of. One thing that nobody ever talks about, strangely, is that these kids, depending on the type of abuse, have to go to hospital. Have to be seen by a gynecologist, for example. Have to be screened for STIs and HIV. There's so many other steps that have to be taken, not just press charges against somebody, because you know yourself how long this process takes.
Yeah.
So when I was a kid, I grew up in Mozambique, and one of the lectures that I had on sex ed was by a guy who was HIV positive. So he was very passionate about prevention. And Mozambique is the second country with the most HIV prevalence in the world, right? And today HIV is more like a chronic disease, but back in those days it was a death sentence. So it's a different context, right? And one of the things he always said, and I remember this even though it was so many years ago, was, what is more important is that you are safe and that you are taken care of. So if you are raped, you go to the hospital first. You don't go to the police and you don't go into all these things. You go to the hospital. Yeah. And there are procedures in the hospital, and there are people trained there to take care of you. When I lived in the UK, I worked for an NGO that had like a halfway house for women who had been trafficked to be sex slaves in the UK, right? And I used to go with some of these girls to their medical checkups, and the service was incredible.
Wow.
This was in Sheffield.
Wow.
And, you know, they were very professional. They were very thoughtful about the questions that they asked. So these are people who are trained to deal with victims of sexual abuse. They're not just any old doctors, right? So if you go to, you know, a health clinic in the UK, I feel that people are generally quite well prepared for this support, right? And then you personally have to make a decision of how much you want to get involved, right? And what kind of emotional toll this is going to take on you, and what are the steps that you need to take to make sure that you are okay as you are helping this child through this process, right?
Yeah, okay. Okay, there's still so much to think about, and now you give me an idea that because we split the presentation into two age groups for the children, 13 to 16, 16 to 18, and then we've got a parents and staff one there as well. And maybe the parents and staff one needs to be geared towards educating them on what to do, as you just mentioned, what to do if there's a disclosure, and how to also keep themselves safe emotionally following disclosure. So the whole sex education thing, which, you know, we're still looking for a different term for that, is, well, I don't know what term we're ever going to use, but, you know, unfortunately sex education is just, you know, it's not the correct term. It comes at all levels, even so you're teaching a child sex education, and as soon as they start turning into an adult, you're still giving them sex education on how to handle children that may be in their lives. Are you a believer that sex education can be taught from the start of what kind of age can it be started at? It's a common question I know people have got. Well, when would we start this, and how would we start this at certain ages?
All right. So one last thing that I would personally ask you for is that when you decide to do these workshops and you know where you're going to do them, that you approach other stakeholders that can make your efforts more sustainable and continuous. So if you are able to find out who in that community, which health center or which nurses are more inclined for this kind of work, and you are able to tell kids if this happens, and if they don't want to talk about it with you, they can go to these places where people will help them deal with these situations.
Yeah, it's almost like I need to. I'm in that Essex area or the Suffolk area is where Taupe is. It's almost like I need to create the final slide of my presentation will be resources, and actually to email that to everybody that attended the presentation afterwards would be really useful.
Yeah. So on your question on when to start sex ed, on my course, I say that you start sex ed during pregnancy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it sounds so crazy, doesn't it? But sex ed while you are pregnant would be your ability to transmit to your child what love feels like. So those things like reading stories to your big belly and getting belly rubs and all these things are seen as sex ed. And that's why the word sex ed is weird when it comes to this, because you wouldn't think of it in that way. But it is proven that fetuses can feel the mother's moods, right? So they do feel love, right? And also because there's these hormones being pumped that are so we are biologically wired for connection. So there's these hormones that the woman then gets flowing through her body that bond her to this baby. And that is why a lot of the times you see women who are very much like, I'm not ready to have a baby. If I fall pregnant, I will have an abortion. And then when they're pregnant, their attitude towards this pregnancy may be different. And it has to do with a connection that starts being built with this being, however you think of it, right? And this is not for or against your right to terminate a pregnancy. It's just a statement that like this, it's so much more complicated than signing a multiple choice thing, right? So when the baby is born, this sexual education is how you touch the baby, how you hold the baby, whether you decide, for example, to co-sleep. And this is I wouldn't say it's more common, it's just more talked about. When you have parents who decide that the baby is going to sleep with them. And there are many studies that prove that this is beneficial for the baby. But then you can't have sex while the baby's in the bed.
Yeah.
You say, yeah, but a lot of people do. Because they're like, oh, he's tiny. He doesn't know what's happening.
Okay.
So right there, you're already starting your sexual education, right? So make sure that you do not have this moment of intimacy with your partner in the presence of your child, right? So I think then you just keep on it's the building blocks, this is not just one conversation, it's incrementally building, right? So child learns how to identify the safe and unsafe touch. Is a very interesting thing, because, for example, you are recommended to narrate the care that you give the kid. So you're changing a diaper, and the idea is that you talk to your kid and you explain to them what you're doing. It's not that they cognitively understand your words, but it creates a pattern. It is a soothing thing in the way that the parents are speaking. And they also, as they grow older and start to understand, they will also understand a hygiene touch and a touch that is not that. Right? Because the kid will be able to feel whether the adult is wiping their bums in a quick and hygienic way, or if there's another intention in that. And you as an adult feel this, right? So like, sometimes kids say, he looked at me funny. Or I just didn't like the way he touched me. Where did he touch you? My hand. But it's just your hand. But the way that person did it, there was something. And it's so difficult to explain, but your body identifies some of these feelings, right? And thinks that this is just not okay, that that person did something that if anybody else had done, it would have been okay, but their intention was not good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And then it's these little conversations about, you know, who can touch where and how and when. And for example, when you see kids self-stimulating, right? So touching their penises or their vulvas, one of the things that you say to them is that nobody, not even mommy or daddy, can touch you like that. They understand the difference between that feeling and the feeling of having their genitals wiped or, you know, cleaned for hygiene purposes. They understand the difference.
Yes. Okay.
You know what I mean?
I get what you mean, but the challenge is, so I completely agree with you. There's a difference there, and they can feel it and they can sense it. It's just about educating them to let us know if the wrong, if they sense something, to let us know.
Yeah. The other thing that is very curious about the body, and I feel like men feel particularly betrayed by their bodies.
Okay.
When they experience abuse. Because if you stimulate it, this is more when they're teenagers and adults, right? If you stimulate the prostate, you will ejaculate. Whether you are enjoying this or not.
Yeah.
Right? So this is something that is very difficult for boys and men to come to grips with, is that they will basically have an orgasm even if their body is being violated.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of men talk about this. Yeah.
You know, so it's the same with kids, because when we talk about sexual abuse, a lot of people think of something violent.
Yes.
When most of the cases do not have any violence. They are touching and patting, because the biggest fear of the abuser is to be caught.
Yes.
Right? So what the abuser is going to do is leave as little evidence behind as possible. Right? So they will rub genitals. It's in very extreme cases that there will be penetration. It will happen, but these are such a small percentage to the rest of them. And the big problem with this is, one, when your genitals are stimulated, you may feel pleasure, even though you are not emotionally engaged with this, or you don't want it, but it may feel nice. So this is one of the problems. The other problem is, how can you prove that there was a crime against the child if there's no evidence of that crime?
Yeah.
Right? And this is where that whole conversation we had about how the safety network reacts, that makes a big difference. Because, you know, if there's no physical violence, you then have to choose to believe your child or not. Right?
Yeah.
So I think it's nothing in the topics we talk about is black and white.
Yeah.
It's all scales of gray, and then you have to take a stance as a person, and then as a parent or a caregiver or a teacher. Right? There are other things that can point to a kid or an adult being sexually abused, that shows in their behavior, but there are very for the police, it's difficult for them to prove that an abuse took place.
Yeah.
Right. You just have to figure out a way of navigating this system.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
But will you only believe your child if the police can prove it, or do you believe your child regardless of what happens?
Well, I think that's I've heard a couple of comments on this. Of course, I would believe my child if they were telling me something, but I don't. I've seen a few videos on when they're younger children. Of course, you believe them, but you also need to ask or work with them to find out what happened, because they may be thinking of something and not explaining it to you properly. So, I mean, that's just a massive question. But Filipa, we've come to an hour, so our IG live is going to cut us off in 3 minutes. So this has been incredible. That hour has gone so quickly.
Yeah.
We also didn't talk about the thing that we wanted to come to talk about, but really that's no problem. I feel like we went through some incredible subjects. I've got this on record, so I am going to format it and put it on my YouTube channel. And I mean, I need to listen to it a number of times. I mean, we've gone through so much information. Let's do this again. I want to start doing more lives and just, you know, having these wonderful conversations. I think it's really great. So a massive thank you for taking the time out for this. And I'll see you again soon, yeah?
Again soon.
Amazing.
All right. Bye.
Bye.